The text arrived at 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, right as I was reviewing blueprints for the Morrison renovation project. My phone buzzed against the metal desk in my cramped office above the hardware store, and I almost ignored it. Construction deadlines wait for no one, especially not when you're running a three-man operation in a town where everyone thinks they can do your job better. But something made me glance at the screen. Maybe it was the timing. Arden never texted during her work hours at Kavanaugh and Associates. The architectural firm kept her busy enough that our conversations had dwindled to logistics about Sophie's soccer practice and Ben's orthodontist appointments. Interesting lunch today. Tell you about it tonight. Make dinner reservations somewhere nice. I stared at the message for a long moment. Arden requesting dinner out was like finding a unicorn in the tool shed. Rare, and probably too good to be true. We hadn't eaten at a restaurant together in months, not since the firm landed that big municipal contract and her schedule became a series of late nights and weekend meetings. My phone rang before I could respond to her text. The caller ID showed my sister Gina's name, and I picked up on the second ring. "Pierce, you busy?" Gina's voice carried that familiar note of concern that usually meant trouble. "Just the usual chaos. What's going on?" I was at the coffee shop on Main Street, and I saw Arden having lunch at Romano's. She wasn't alone. I set down my pencil and leaned back in the creaky office chair. Business lunch, probably. She's always meeting with clients. This didn't look like business. The guy was holding her hand across the table, and she was laughing like I haven't seen her laugh in years. Real animated, you know? Like she was performing for him. Something cold settled in my stomach, but I kept my voice steady. "Did you recognize him?" Tall, dark hair, expensive suit. Looked familiar, but I couldn't place him. "Pierce, I wouldn't have called if it didn't seem—" "I know. Thanks for telling me." After I hung up, I sat staring at the blueprints without seeing them. Arden's text took on a different meaning now. Interesting lunch indeed. The afternoon dragged by in a haze of measurements and material calculations. But my mind kept circling back to that image of my wife holding hands with a stranger. By the time I locked up the office and headed home, I had convinced myself that Gina had misread the situation. Arden was ambitious and charming when she needed to be. Maybe she was just closing a deal. Our house sat on Maple Street, in the older part of town, a Victorian-era structure that we'd bought 15 years ago with dreams of restoration. The reality was peeling paint, a front porch that sagged slightly, and windows that needed replacing before another winter. The mortgage payments were manageable, but the upkeep costs kept pushing other priorities down the list. I found Arden in the kitchen, changed out of her work clothes into jeans and a sweater that I remembered buying her for Christmas 2 years ago. She looked relaxed in a way that seemed almost foreign after months of stressed expressions and distracted conversations. "How was your day?" I asked, opening the refrigerator and pulling out a beer. "Good. Really good, actually." She turned from the stove where she was heating up leftover pasta. "I made those reservations for tonight, 7:30 at Bellacourt." Bellacourt was the nicest restaurant in town, the kind of place we used to go for anniversaries and special occasions, the kind of place that required reservations and cost more than our usual Tuesday night budget. "What's the occasion?" Arden smiled, and there was something in her expression that I couldn't quite read. "Can't a wife want to have dinner with her husband?" "Of course. I'm just surprised." She moved closer, reaching up to straighten my collar in a gesture that felt rehearsed. "I had an interesting conversation at lunch today. Someone from my past reached out, and it got me thinking about a lot of things." "Someone from your past?" "My ex-fiancé, actually. David Brennan. Remember I told you about him? We dated in college. Were engaged for about 6 months before I broke it off." I remembered. Arden had mentioned David exactly twice in our 17 years of marriage. Once when we were dating and she was explaining why she was gun-shy about commitment, and once when we drove past his law office downtown and she'd pointed it out with obvious pride that he'd done well for himself. What did he want? Arden's smile widened, and I caught a glint in her eyes that made my chest tighten. He proposed to me. Again, right there in Romano's, got down on one knee and everything. Said he's never stopped thinking about me, never stopped regretting that I got away. The pasta sauce bubbled on the stove, filling the silence that stretched between us. I took a long pull from my beer and studied my wife's face, looking for some sign that this was a joke or a test or anything other than what it sounded like. Really? I kept my voice level, almost bored. I'm sure she'll choose better this time. Arden blinked, clearly thrown by my response. She? His next girlfriend. When you turn him down and he moves on to someone else. I'm sure she'll have better judgment than to get involved with a guy who proposes to married women in public restaurants. For just a moment, Arden's confident expression flickered. Then she laughed, but it sounded forced. You're not even a little bit concerned? Your wife just told you another man proposed to her. Should I be? You said no, right? I told him I needed time to think about it. The words hit me like a punch to the solar plexus, but I kept my expression neutral. Time to think about what, exactly? About whether I'm happy, about whether this is the life I want, about whether I married the right person. I set my beer down on the counter with deliberate care. And are you? Happy, I mean. Arden turned back to the stove, stirring the sauce with more attention than it required. I don't know anymore, Pierce. When David was talking today, describing the life he could give me, the opportunities, the travel, the financial security, it made me realize how small our world has become. Small. Don't take it personally. I'm just saying that maybe we settled into this routine too easily. Maybe we stopped growing. I watched her profile as she spoke, noting the way she held her shoulders straighter than usual, the careful way she chose her words. This wasn't a spontaneous conversation. This was a speech she'd practiced. So what happens now? Now we go to dinner and talk about it like adults. David wants an answer by Friday. That's 3 days. Yes. And you're seriously considering leaving me for a guy you haven't seen in 20 years? Arden finally turned to face me, and her expression had hardened into something I didn't recognize. I'm considering my options. I'm 42 years old, Pierce. If I'm going to make a change, it has to be now. The kitchen felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in around us. Through the window, I could see our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, working in her garden, probably wondering why we were having what looked like an intense conversation at 5:30 on a Tuesday. What about Sophie and Ben? They're old enough to understand. Sophie's graduating next year anyway, and Ben's resilient. Kids adapt. Kids adapt. I repeated her words slowly, tasting the casual cruelty in them. That's your maternal instinct talking? Don't be dramatic. Plenty of families go through transitions. We'd work out custody arrangements, split time fairly. David's very understanding about the situation. David's understanding. How generous of him. Arden's phone buzzed on the counter, and she glanced at it with an expression that told me everything I needed to know. The smile that crossed her face was soft and private, the kind of smile I remembered her giving me when we were dating. We should get ready for dinner, she said, slipping the phone into her pocket. I want to look nice tonight. I nodded and headed upstairs to change clothes, my mind already working through the implications of what I'd just heard. In the bedroom we'd shared for 15 years, I pulled on a clean shirt and tried to process the fact that my wife was seriously considering leaving me for a man who'd proposed to her over lunch at Romano's. But as I knotted my tie in the mirror, I found myself thinking about something else entirely. Arden had said David's last name was Brennan, but I was pretty sure the law office she'd pointed out years ago had a different name on the sign. Kavanaugh and Associates, maybe. Or was that her firm? I made a mental note to drive by the office district tomorrow and check. If Arden was going to blow up our life for a romantic gesture, I wanted to know exactly who I was dealing with. The drive to Bella Court took 15 minutes, enough time for Arden to touch up her makeup and for me to rehearse staying calm. She'd dressed carefully for dinner, a black dress I'd never seen before, jewelry that caught the light when she moved. She looked beautiful and distant, like she was already practicing being someone else's wife. The restaurant was busy for a Tuesday night, filled with couples celebrating anniversaries and business dinners that ran late. Our table was by the window, overlooking the small park in the center of town where they held the farmers' market on weekends. "This is nice," Arden said, settling into her chair and glancing around the dining room. "We should do this more often." "We should do a lot of things more often." She looked at me across the table, her expression serious. "That's exactly what I mean, Pierce. When did we stop trying? When did we stop making an effort with each other?" I put in the effort every single day. I work 60-hour weeks to keep the business afloat so we can cover the mortgage, Sophie's college fund, and Ben's orthodontist. I repair everything that breaks in that house, coach Ben's Little League team, and make it to Sophie's soccer games even when I'm completely exhausted from a long day at the construction site. That's not what I'm talking about. Then what are you talking about? Arden leaned forward, her voice dropping to a more intimate level. "When's the last time you surprised me? When's the last time you planned something romantic, or told me I looked beautiful, or made me feel like I was more than just another item on your to-do list?" The accusation stung because it held enough truth to hurt. "When's the last time you seemed like you wanted any of those things? When's the last time you looked up from your phone during dinner or asked about my day or acted like you were interested in anything I had to say? We're both guilty of letting things slide. That's my point. Maybe we've just grown apart naturally. Or maybe you've been planning this conversation since David Brennan walked back into your life." Arden's cheeks flushed slightly. "It's not like that." "What's it like then? Help me understand how a man proposes to a married woman he hasn't seen in 20 years, and she seriously considers saying yes." "He's successful, Pierce. Really successful. He owns a law firm, has a house in the hills, travels to Europe twice a year. He could give me things, experiences, opportunities, a life that's bigger than this town." I looked around the restaurant, at the couples sharing quiet conversations and the families celebrating small occasions. What's wrong with this town? Nothing's wrong with it. It's just limited. David was talking about his place in Tuscany, about the art galleries in Florence, about having the freedom to explore the world. When's the last time we went anywhere, Pierce? When's the last time we did anything that didn't revolve around work and kids and paying bills? We went to the beach last summer. For 3 days, at a motel, where you spent half the time on work calls. The waiter appeared to take our order, and we went through the motions of choosing entrees and wine, maintaining the pretense of a normal dinner conversation. But underneath the surface politeness, I could feel something fundamental shifting between us. "Tell me about the proposal," I said after the waiter left. "How exactly does that conversation start?" Arden's eyes lit up, and I realized she'd been waiting for me to ask. "He said he'd been thinking about me for months, wondering if I was happy. He hired a private investigator to find out where I was living, what I was doing. He hired a private investigator. He wanted to make sure I was okay before he reached out. Isn't that sweet?" Sweet wasn't the word I would have chosen. "So he's been watching you?" "Not watching, just checking up on me, making sure I was safe and happy." "And the investigator told him you weren't happy?" Arden's smile faltered slightly. "He could tell from my social media that things weren't perfect. I haven't posted many pictures of us lately, and the ones I have posted don't exactly scream marital bliss." I thought about Arden's Instagram account, which had indeed become a collection of work photos, pictures of the kids, and scenic shots that carefully excluded me. I'd noticed but hadn't said anything, assuming it was just a phase. "So he decided to swoop in and rescue you." "He decided to take a chance. He said he's never stopped loving me, Never stopped wondering what would have happened if I'd said yes 20 years ago. And what would have happened? We'd be living in his house in the hills, traveling the world, having adventures. He showed me pictures on his phone, his art collection, his wine cellar, his view of the valley. It's beautiful, Pierce. Really beautiful. I sipped my wine and tried to imagine my wife in the life she was describing. It wasn't hard to picture. Arden had always been drawn to luxury and status, had always chafed against the financial limitations of our middle-class existence. What did you tell him? I told him I was flattered but that I needed time to think. I have a family, responsibilities. I can't just walk away from my life. But you want to. Arden was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the park where a few teenagers were skateboarding under the streetlights. I want to stay. Does that make sense? Not really. I want to feel excited about our life together. I want to wake up in the morning and feel grateful for what we have instead of wondering what I'm missing. I want to look at you and feel something more than comfortable resignation. The words hit harder than a slap. Comfortable resignation. I'm sorry, that came out wrong. Did it? Our entrees arrived, providing a temporary distraction from the conversation that was systematically dismantling 17 years of marriage. I cut into my steak and tried to think of something to say that would salvage the evening, some argument that would make Arden remember why she'd chosen me in the first place. But the truth was, I couldn't remember either. We'd met in college, dated for 3 years, gotten married because it seemed like the logical next step. We'd been happy enough, built a decent life together, raised 2 good kids. When had that stopped being enough? What does he do for a living? I asked. David, I mean. He's a lawyer. Corporate law, mostly. He has about 30 people working for him. And he's not married? Divorced. No kids. He said he never found anyone who measured up to me. I almost choked on my wine. He said that? He's very romantic. Always was, even in college. He used to write me poetry, bring me flowers for no reason. Remember when you used to do things like that? I did remember, vaguely. The early days of our relationship when everything felt significant and worth celebrating. When had I stopped bringing her flowers? When had she stopped seeming pleased when I did? So what happens now? I asked. You have 3 days to decide whether to blow up our family for a guy who writes poetry? It's not just about David. It's about what he represents. The possibility that there's still time to have a different kind of life. What kind of life? One where I'm not just Pierce Eldrow's wife and Sophie and Ben's mother. One where I'm someone interesting in my own right. You are interesting. You're a successful architect. You're smart. I'm a small-town architect who designs strip malls and office buildings. David's talking about projects in major cities, buildings that matter, work that makes a difference. And he can give you that? He has connections. He knows people. He could open doors for me that will never open in this town. I pushed food around my plate, my appetite gone. What about Sophie and Ben? They'd visit. Summers, holidays, school breaks. David's house has plenty of room, and he's excited about being a stepfather. He's excited about being a stepfather to kids he's never met. He's excited about building a life with me. The kids are part of that. I tried to imagine Sophie and Ben spending summers with their mother and a stranger in a house in the hills, tried to picture myself explaining to them why Mommy had decided she needed a different kind of life. The image made my chest tight. Have you talked to them about this? Not yet. I wanted to talk to you first. How considerate. Arden set down her fork and looked at me with an expression that might have been pity. I know you're angry. I know this isn't what you want to hear. But I need you to understand that this isn't about you not being good enough. It's about me needing something different. Something David can give you that I can't. Yes. The simple honesty of her answer was somehow worse than all the elaborate explanations. I signaled the waiter for the check, suddenly eager to get out of the restaurant and away from the curious glances of other diners who might be picking up on the tension at our table. "I want to meet him," I said as we waited for the bill. "What?" "David. I want to meet the man who's trying to steal my wife." "He's not trying to steal me, Pierce. He's offering me a choice." "Same thing. I want to meet him." Arden looked uncomfortable for the first time all evening. "I don't think that's a good idea." "Why not? If he's going to be my kid's stepfather, don't I have a right to know what kind of man he is?" "It would just be awkward for everyone." "More awkward than your husband finding out his wife is considering leaving him for her college boyfriend?" The waiter brought the check, and I paid it quickly, eager to end the evening before I said something I'd regret. The drive home was silent, except for the radio playing soft jazz that seemed to mock the wreckage of our dinner conversation. At home, Sophie was in her room with the door closed, music playing loudly enough to vibrate the walls. Ben was in the living room playing video games, and he looked up when we came in. "How was dinner?" he asked. "Fine," Arden said, already heading for the stairs. "I'm going to take a bath and go to bed early." Ben looked at me questioningly, and I ruffled his hair. "Everything's okay, buddy. How was your day?" He launched into a story about a pop quiz in history class and a fight during lunch that had gotten 2 kids suspended. I listened with half my attention while the other half processed the evening's revelations. When Ben finally headed upstairs to brush his teeth, I was alone with my thoughts and a growing sense that my life was about to change in ways I couldn't control. I walked through the house, looking at the family photos on the mantel, the kids' artwork still hanging on the refrigerator, the wedding picture in the hallway where Arden and I looked impossibly young and optimistic. Had we really been happy then, or had I just been too inexperienced to recognize the warning signs? My phone buzzed with a text message, and I glanced at it absently. The message was from a number I didn't recognize. "Thanks for dinner. Can't wait to see you tomorrow. D." I stared at the message for a long moment before I realized what had happened. Arden had left her phone on the kitchen counter when she went upstairs, and David Brennan was texting her goodnight. Tomorrow. They were seeing each other again tomorrow. I deleted the message and set the phone back where I'd found it, then poured myself a whiskey and sat at the kitchen table. Through the window, I could see the lights in Mrs. Patterson's house going out one by one as she prepared for bed, probably looking forward to another ordinary day in her ordinary life. I envied her. I woke up at 5:30 Wednesday morning with the kind of clarity that only comes from a sleepless night spent planning. Arden was still asleep beside me, her face peaceful in a way that suggested she wasn't wrestling with the same questions that had kept me staring at the ceiling. The house was quiet as I made coffee and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. If my wife was going to make a decision that would reshape our entire family, I wanted to know exactly who was influencing that decision. David Brennan turned out to be surprisingly easy to research. His law firm's website featured a professional headshot that showed a man in his early 40s with the kind of polished confidence that comes from success and money. The bio listed his education, Harvard Law, summa cum laude, his specialties in corporate mergers and acquisitions, and his membership in various professional organizations. What it didn't mention was the house in the hills, or the place in Tuscany, or any of the other details Arden had shared over dinner. Those came from a deeper dive into public records and social media accounts that painted a picture of a man who lived well, but perhaps not as well as he wanted people to believe. The house in the hills was real, a 4-bedroom contemporary on 2 acres with a view of the valley. But the mortgage records showed he'd bought it 18 months ago with a significant loan, and the property tax assessment suggested it was worth less than he'd paid. The Tuscany property was harder to verify, but a reverse image search on the photos from his Instagram account showed they were stock images from a travel website. David Brennan was successful, but he was also leveraged to the hilt and apparently willing to embellish the truth when it served his purposes. I was still researching when Arden came downstairs at 7, already dressed for work in a navy suit that I'd never seen before. She moved through the kitchen with the kind of focused energy that suggested she had somewhere important to be. "You're up early," she said, pouring coffee into a travel mug. "Couldn't sleep. Too much on my mind." She glanced at my laptop screen, but I'd closed the browser windows when I heard her footsteps on the stairs. "Pierce, about last night. What time are you meeting him today?" Arden paused with her coffee halfway to her lips. "How did you know I was meeting him today?" "Lucky guess. We're having lunch. Just to talk more about the logistics of everything." Logistics. If I decide to move forward, there are practical considerations. My job, the kids' schools, custody arrangements. David wants to help me think through all the details. I nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "Where are you meeting?" "The Riverside Inn. It's quieter than Romano's, more private." The Riverside Inn was 20 minutes outside town, the kind of place that catered to business travelers and couples looking for discretion. It was also expensive enough that most locals only went there for special occasions. "Sounds nice. What time?" 12:30. Why?" "Just curious about my wife's schedule." Arden studied my face for a moment, as if trying to read some hidden meaning in my words. "I should be back by 3. I have a client meeting at 4. After she left, I called my foreman and told him I'd be late to the job site. Then I drove across town to my sister's apartment, a tidy 2-bedroom place above the bakery where she worked as a manager. Gina was getting ready for work when I knocked, but she took one look at my face and invited me in for coffee. "You look like hell," she said, settling into her kitchen chair with a mug that read, "World's Best Aunt." Arden wants to leave me. I told her about the dinner conversation, about David Brennan's proposal, about the 3-day deadline for a decision that would determine the rest of my life. Gina listened without interrupting, her expression growing more incredulous with each detail. "She told you another man proposed to her and expected you to just accept it?" "She expected me to fight for her, I think, to make some grand gesture that would prove I'm worth staying for." "And are you going to?" I thought about the question seriously. I don't know. Part of me wants to. Part of me thinks if she's willing to throw away 17 years for a guy she hasn't seen in 20 years, maybe I should let her go. What about Sophie and Ben? That's the part that's driving me crazy. She talks about them like they're just another logistical challenge to work around. Gina shook her head. Kids don't adapt to their parents getting divorced so mom can run off with her college boyfriend. They survive it maybe, but they don't adapt. I know. So what are you going to do? I pulled out my phone and showed her the research I'd compiled on David Brennan. I'm going to find out who we're really dealing with. Gina scrolled through the information, her eyebrows rising as she took in the details about the mortgage, the stock photos, the careful construction of an image that didn't quite match reality. He's lying to her. About some things anyway. The question is whether she knows it and doesn't care, or whether she's being played. Either way, she's making a mistake. Maybe. Or maybe she's just unhappy enough that she's willing to take a chance on anything that looks different from what we have. Gina handed back my phone. What do you need from me? I need you to help me figure out what David Brennan really wants, because I don't think this is just about rekindling an old romance. We spent the next hour going through everything I'd found, looking for patterns and connections that might explain why a successful lawyer would go to such elaborate lengths to win back a woman he'd dated 20 years ago. The answer, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more complicated than I'd expected. David Brennan's law firm was in financial trouble. Not bankruptcy-level trouble, but the kind of cash flow problems that come from expanding too quickly and taking on too much debt. He'd hired aggressively, moved to expensive offices, and taken on overhead that required a constant stream of high-value clients to sustain. But the real revelation came when Gina found a local business journal article from 6 months ago about municipal contracts being awarded for a major downtown redevelopment project. The city was planning to tear down 3 blocks of old buildings and replace them with a mixed-use complex that would include retail, office space, and luxury condos. The architectural firm handling the project was Kavanaugh and Associates, Arden's firm. "He's not trying to win her back," Gina said, staring at the article. "He's trying to get access to the biggest municipal contract this town has seen in 20 years. I felt something cold settle in my stomach as the pieces fell into place. She's the project manager. She'd have access to all the bidding information, the timeline, the inside details that would give a law firm a huge advantage in getting the legal work. And if he marries her, he gets a wife and a business partner, while I get to explain to my kids why their mother left us for a man who's using her." Gina reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You have to tell her." "Tell her what? That her knight in shining armor might have ulterior motives? She'll think I'm just trying to sabotage her chance at happiness." "Then prove it." "How?" Gina was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then she smiled, and I recognized the expression from our childhood when she was about to suggest something that would get us both in trouble. "You said they're meeting at the Riverside Inn at 12:30? "Yeah." "And she thinks you're going to be at the construction site all day?" "That was the plan." "So, let's change the plan." An hour later, I was parked across the street from the Riverside Inn, watching the parking lot through binoculars that Gina had borrowed from her boyfriend's hunting gear. It felt ridiculous and desperate, but I needed to see David Brennan in person, needed to get a sense of who I was dealing with. He arrived at 12:20 in a silver BMW that looked like it had just rolled off the lot. Even from a distance, I could see that he moved with the kind of confidence that comes from being used to getting what you want. He was tall and lean, with dark hair that was perfectly styled and a suit that probably cost more than I made in a week. Arden arrived 5 minutes later in her Honda Civic, and I watched her check her reflection in the rearview mirror before getting out. She'd changed clothes since leaving the house that morning. The navy suit had been replaced by a black dress that was more appropriate for dinner than lunch. They met in the parking lot, and David greeted her with a kiss on the cheek that lingered longer than necessary. Then he put his hand on the small of her back and guided her toward the restaurant entrance, a gesture that was both possessive and intimate. I waited 10 minutes, then followed them inside. The Riverside Inn's dining room was dimly lit and designed for privacy, with high-backed booths and soft music that muffled conversations. I took a table in the corner where I could see David and Arden without being easily spotted, ordered a sandwich I didn't want, and tried to look like a businessman having a quiet lunch alone. From my vantage point, I could see that they were deep in conversation, their heads bent close together over what appeared to be a folder of documents. David was doing most of the talking, gesturing with his hands and occasionally reaching across the table to touch Arden's arm for emphasis. Whatever he was saying, she was completely absorbed. She laughed at his jokes, nodded at his explanations, and looked at him with an expression of rapt attention that I hadn't seen her direct toward me in years. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I didn't need to. The body language told the whole story. This wasn't just a man trying to win back an old girlfriend. This was a seduction, carefully orchestrated and expertly executed. When the waiter brought their wine, an expensive bottle that David made a show of selecting and tasting, he raised his glass in a toast. I watched Arden smile and clink her glass against his, and something twisted in my chest that might have been jealousy or might have been grief. They were together for almost 2 hours. I nursed my coffee and pretended to read emails on my phone while tracking their conversation through peripheral vision. By the time they finally stood to leave, Arden was glowing with the kind of happiness that comes from feeling desired and special. In the parking lot, David walked her to her car and kissed her goodbye. Not on the cheek this time, but on the lips, with his hands on her waist and her arms around his neck. It was the kind of kiss that suggested they'd moved well beyond the realm of old friends catching up. I waited until both cars had left the parking lot before I went to the bar and struck up a conversation with the bartender, a young guy named Kevin who looked like he was working his way through college. "Busy lunch crowd today," I said, ordering a beer I didn't want. "Yeah, we get a lot of business meetings. People like the privacy." I thought I recognized the couple at table 12. The woman looked familiar. Kevin glanced around the empty dining room, then leaned closer. "The guy's a regular, comes in a couple times a week with different women, always orders the same wine, always tips well." "Different women?" "Business meetings, I think. He's a lawyer or something, always very professional, but you can tell he's trying to impress them." I left a generous tip and drove back to town with my head spinning. David Brennan was a regular at the Riverside Inn, and he brought different women there on a regular basis. The romantic lunch with my wife wasn't unique. It was part of a pattern. But the question remained, what was he really after? I spent the rest of the afternoon at the construction site, going through the motions of supervising the Morrison renovation, while my mind worked through everything I'd learned. By the time I got home, I had the beginnings of a plan. Arden was in the kitchen when I walked in, humming while she prepared dinner. She looked relaxed and happy, more animated than I'd seen her in months. "How was your day?" she asked, not looking up from the cutting board where she was chopping vegetables. "The usual. How was yours?" "Good, really good. I had a productive meeting with a potential client." "Anyone I know?" "Just someone interested in some architectural work. Nothing major." I opened a beer and leaned against the counter, watching her cook. "Arden, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Are you happy?" She paused in her chopping and looked at me with surprise. "What do you mean?" "I mean, setting aside David and his proposal and everything that's happened in the last 2 days, are you happy with your life? With our life?" Arden set down her knife and turned to face me fully. "That's a complicated question. It doesn't have to be. I'm content most of the time. I love the kids, I like my work, I'm proud of what we've built together. But happy? I don't know if I even remember what that feels like anymore." "When's the last time you remember being happy?" She thought about it for a long moment. "Maybe when Sophie was little and we used to take those weekend trips to the lake. Remember how she'd insist on building sand castles even though the beach was all rocks and weeds?" I remembered. Sophie had been maybe 4 years old, determined to make the best of our modest family vacations. Arden had been patient and playful then, willing to spend hours helping our daughter construct elaborate fortifications against the tiny waves. What changed? Life, I guess. Work got more demanding, the kids got older and needed different things. We got caught up in the routine of just getting through each day. "And you think David can give you that feeling back?" Arden's cheeks flushed slightly. "He makes me feel interesting again, like I'm worth pursuing, worth impressing. When's the last time you looked at me the way he looks at me?" The question hit home because I couldn't answer it. When had I stopped seeing Arden as a woman I wanted to win over and started seeing her as simply my wife, part of the landscape of my daily life? "I look at you every day." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." Before I could respond, Sophie came into the kitchen, earbuds in and phone in hand, the universal teenager signal for, "Don't bother me." She grabbed an apple from the fruit bowl and headed back toward the stairs. "Dinner in 20 minutes, Arden called after her. "I'm not hungry," Sophie replied without breaking stride. "You still need to sit with the family." "Why? So we can pretend everything's normal?" Sophie's words stopped both Arden and me cold. Our 17-year-old daughter paused at the bottom of the stairs, pulling out one earbud to look at us with an expression that was far too knowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Arden asked. "It means I'm not stupid, Mom. I can tell when something's wrong. You've been acting weird all week. Dad looks like someone ran over his dog, and you're both being super polite to each other like you're strangers." "Everything's fine, honey," Arden said, but her voice lacked conviction. "Right. And I'm sure it's just a coincidence that you've been getting dressed up for work and staying out later and smiling at your phone all the time. I looked at Arden, whose face had gone pale. Sophie, whatever. Just let me know when you're ready to tell us what's really going on, okay? Ben might not notice, but I'm not blind. She disappeared upstairs, leaving Arden and me staring at each other across the kitchen. She knows something's up, I said. She doesn't know anything specific. She knows enough. Kids aren't stupid, Arden. They can sense when their parents are having problems. Arden turned back to her vegetables, but her hands were shaking slightly as she resumed chopping. Maybe we should tell them sooner rather than later. Tell them what, exactly? That we're having some difficulties, that we're working through some things. Are we? Working through things? I don't know. Are we? I studied her profile, noting the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she was avoiding my eyes. That depends on what you decided at lunch today. I haven't decided anything yet. But you're leaning toward leaving. Arden set down her knife again and looked at me with an expression that might have been sadness or might have been relief. I think I am, yes. The words hung in the air between us like a physical presence. I'd known this moment was coming since yesterday's dinner conversation, but hearing it confirmed still felt like a punch to the gut. Because of David. Because of what David represents. The possibility of something different, something more. And what about what we represent? 17 years of marriage, 2 kids, a life we built together? I'm not dismissing that. I'm just not sure it's enough anymore. I finished my beer and set the empty bottle on the counter with deliberate care. I want to meet him, Pierce. I want to meet the man who's convincing my wife to leave me. I want to look him in the eye and hear him explain why breaking up our family is worth it for whatever he's offering you. It won't change anything. Maybe not. But I deserve that much, don't you think? Arden was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the backyard where Ben was shooting baskets by himself, the rhythmic bounce of the ball providing a soundtrack to our conversation. I'll ask him, she said finally. Ask him what? If he's willing to meet you, to have a conversation. When? I don't know. Soon, I guess. If we're going to do this, we should do it before Friday. Friday, the deadline David had given her for a decision, 2 days away. Set it up, I said. The sooner the better. That night, after the kids had gone to bed and Arden was in the bathroom getting ready for sleep, I sat in my home office and continued my research into David Brennan's background. The more I dug, the more convinced I became that his interest in Arden was at least partially motivated by business considerations. But I also found something else, something that made me reach for my phone and call Gina. I need you to do me a favor, I said when she answered. What kind of favor? I need you to find out everything you can about David Brennan's personal life, who he dates, where he goes, what he does when he's not trying to impress potential clients. Pierce, I found something, Gina. Something that suggests this whole romantic reunion might not be what it seems. I told her about the bartender at the Riverside Inn, about David's pattern of bringing different women there for business meetings. I told her about the financial pressures on his law firm and the timing of his reappearance in Arden's life, just as her firm was managing the biggest municipal contract in town. You think he's running some kind of long con? I think he's a man who's used to getting what he wants, and right now he wants something from my wife. The question is whether it's her heart or her access to inside information about city contracts. Or both. Or both. Gina was quiet for a moment. What do you want me to do? You know people all over town. You hear things. I need you to ask around, see if anyone knows anything about David Brennan that might not be in the public records. And if I find something, then we figure out how to use it. After I hung up, I sat in the dark office listening to the sounds of the house settling around me. Upstairs, I could hear the murmur of Arden's voice as she talked on the phone, probably to David, probably making plans for their next meeting. In 2 days, she would give him an answer that would determine the rest of our lives. I intended to make sure she had all the information she needed to make that decision, even if she didn't want to hear it. Thursday morning brought rain and the kind of gray sky that matched my mood perfectly. I woke up to find Arden already gone, a note on the kitchen counter explaining that she had an early meeting and would be home late. The note was signed A instead of Love Arden or any of the other small endearments that had once punctuated our daily communications. Sophie was at the breakfast table, scrolling through her phone while eating cereal. She looked up when I came into the kitchen, and I could see the questions in her eyes that she was too polite or too scared to ask. "Dad, are you and Mom getting divorced?" The directness of the question caught me off guard. I poured coffee and sat down across from her, buying time while I figured out how to answer. "Why would you ask that?" "Because you're both acting like people do in movies right before they announce they're getting divorced. All weird and polite and sad." I studied my daughter's face, noting the way she was trying to look casual while obviously bracing herself for bad news. Sophie had inherited Arden's intelligence and my stubborn streak, a combination that made her impossible to fool when she sensed something was wrong. "Your mom and I are going through a difficult time right now," I said finally. "We're trying to work things out. But you might not be able to. We might not be able to." Sophie nodded as if she'd expected this answer. "Is there someone else?" The question hit me like a physical blow. "What makes you ask that?" "Mom's been different lately. Happier, but in a weird way, like she's excited about something she can't tell us about." I marveled at my daughter's perceptiveness, while simultaneously wishing she was less observant. "It's complicated, honey." That's what adults always say when they don't want to explain something to kids. Sometimes things really are complicated. Sophie finished her cereal and stood up, slinging her backpack over her shoulder. "Just promise me you'll tell us what's going on before you make any big decisions, okay? Ben and I deserve to know what's happening to our family." After she left for school, I sat alone in the kitchen with my coffee and tried to imagine how I would explain the situation if Arden decided to leave. How do you tell your kids that their mother chose a different life, that love sometimes isn't enough to hold a family together? My phone rang at 9:30. Arden's name appeared on the caller ID, and I answered on the second ring. "David wants to meet you," she said without preamble. "When?" "Tonight, 7 o'clock at Mallory's pub." Mallory's was a local bar that catered to an older crowd, the kind of place where conversations could be held without interruption from loud music or college students. It was also public enough that neither David nor I would be tempted to do anything stupid. "I'll be there." "Pierce, I want you to promise me something." "What?" "Promise me you'll keep an open mind. David's a good man, and he's trying to do the right thing by meeting you. Don't go in there looking for a fight." "I'm not looking for a fight, Arden. I'm looking for answers." "What kind of answers?" "I want to understand why a successful lawyer would propose to a married woman he hasn't seen in 20 years. I want to know what he really wants from you." "He wants me. Is that so hard to believe? After one lunch meeting, after 20 years of no contact, yes, it's hard to believe." Arden was quiet for a moment. "He's been thinking about me for a long time, Pierce. He hired someone to find me, to make sure I was okay. That's not the behavior of someone with ulterior motives." "That's exactly the behavior of someone with ulterior motives. I'm not going to argue with you about this. Just meet him, talk to him, and try to understand why I'm considering his offer." "His offer. His proposal. You know what I mean." After she hung up, I called Gina and told her about the evening's plans. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" she asked. "Probably not, but I need to look him in the eye and get a sense of who I'm dealing with. What if he's exactly what he appears to be? What if he really is just a guy who's been carrying a torch for 20 years and finally decided to do something about it? Then Arden will leave me for him, and I'll have to figure out how to move on with my life. And if he's not, Then I'll have to figure out how to convince her she's making a mistake without sounding like a jealous husband who's grasping at straws. I spent the day at the construction site, trying to focus on work while my mind rehearsed conversations with David Brennan. By the time I headed home to shower and change clothes, I had run through dozens of scenarios, none of which ended with him graciously withdrawing his proposal and disappearing from our lives. Mallory's pub was busy for a Thursday night, filled with the usual mix of regulars and after-work crowds. I arrived a few minutes early and claimed a table in the back corner where we could talk without being overheard. The bartender, a woman named Carol who'd been working there for 15 years, brought me a beer and asked if I was expecting company. Just one other person, should be here soon. David Brennan arrived exactly on time, scanning the room until he spotted me. Up close, he was even more polished than he'd appeared from a distance, with the kind of expensive grooming that suggested he spent serious money on his appearance. His handshake was firm, his smile was confident, and his eyes held the calculating intelligence of someone who was used to winning. "Pierce, I appreciate you agreeing to meet with me. I know this situation is awkward for everyone involved." Awkward is one word for it. David signaled Carol for a drink, something top shelf that cost 3 times what my beer had cost, and settled into his chair with the easy confidence of a man who was comfortable in any situation. "I want you to know that I have tremendous respect for you," he said. "Arden's told me a lot about the life you've built together, the family you've raised. You're clearly a good man and a good father. But not good enough to keep my wife happy. That's not what this is about. Sometimes people grow apart, develop different needs and desires. It doesn't mean anyone's at fault." I studied his face, looking for some tell that would reveal his true motivations. "Arden says you proposed to her at Romano's, got down on one knee in front of everyone." "I did. That's a bold move for a man who hasn't seen her in 20 years. David's smile widened. "I've always been decisive when I know what I want." "And what do you want exactly?" "I want to marry Arden and give her the kind of life she deserves. I want to travel with her, show her the world, help her achieve her professional goals. I want to make her happy." "Professional goals?" "Arden's incredibly talented, but she's been limited by the scope of projects available in a town this size. I have connections in major cities, relationships with developers who handle significant commercial and residential projects. I could help her build the kind of career she's always dreamed of." There it was, the business angle wrapped up in romantic language, but unmistakably present. "What kind of projects are we talking about?" "High-rise developments, urban planning initiatives, municipal contracts worth tens of millions of dollars. The kind of work that makes a real difference in people's lives." "Municipal contracts." "Among other things, yes." I took a long pull from my beer, processing this confirmation of what I'd suspected. "And you think Arden would be interested in that kind of work?" "I know she would be. We've talked about it extensively." "When?" "You've only been back in touch with her for 3 days." David's expression flickered almost imperceptibly. "We've been in contact for longer than that." "How much longer?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to me. My wife told me you reached out to her this week. Are you saying that's not true?" David was quiet for a moment, apparently weighing his options. "I first contacted Arden about 6 weeks ago. We've been having conversations about the future, about possibilities. The proposal was just the formal culmination of those discussions." 6 weeks. Arden had been talking to David Brennan for 6 weeks without telling me, planning a future that didn't include me while I went about my daily routine, completely unaware that my marriage was ending. 6 weeks of secret conversations. I asked her to keep our communication confidential until we could figure out the best way to handle the situation. I didn't want to cause unnecessary drama if nothing came of it. How considerate. "Pierce, I understand why you're angry. If I were in your position, I'd feel the same way. But you have to understand that what's happening between Arden and me isn't about hurting you or your children. It's about two people who found each other again and realized they still have strong feelings for each other. Strong feelings that developed over 6 weeks of secret phone calls. Strong feelings that never really went away. The phone calls just reminded us both of what we used to have together. I signaled Carol for another beer, buying time while I processed this new information. Arden hadn't just been tempted by an unexpected proposal from an old boyfriend. She'd been conducting a 6-week emotional affair, planning her exit strategy while maintaining the pretense of our normal family life. "What do you know about Arden's current work?" I asked. "I know she's talented and underutilized. I know she's been working on some interesting municipal projects that showcase her abilities." "Anything specific?" David's eyes sharpened slightly, and I could see him calculating how much to reveal. "The downtown redevelopment project is particularly impressive. The scope of the planning, the integration of commercial and residential spaces, the attention to environmental concerns, it's exactly the kind of innovative thinking that major developers are looking for." "And you'd be interested in getting involved in that kind of project?" "If the opportunity arose, certainly. But that's not why I'm here, Pierce. I'm here because I love Arden and want to build a life with her. A life that would conveniently include access to inside information about municipal contracts worth tens of millions of dollars." David's friendly expression hardened slightly. "I resent the implication that my feelings for Arden are motivated by business considerations." "Then help me understand the timeline. You haven't seen her in 20 years, but suddenly you hire a private investigator to track her down just as her firm lands the biggest municipal contract in the city's history. That seems like quite a coincidence." "Sometimes life is full of coincidences." "Sometimes. And sometimes successful lawyers do their homework before making major moves." We stared at each other across the table, the pretense of polite conversation finally stripped away. David Brennan was smart enough to know that I'd figured out at least part of his game, and I was angry enough to stop pretending I believed his romantic reunion story. "What do you want from me?" he asked finally. "I want you to leave my wife alone." "That's not going to happen." "Why not? If this is really about love, surely you want what's best for her. Breaking up her family, disrupting her children's lives, convincing her to abandon everything she's built here. How is any of that in her best interest?" "Because she's not happy, Pierce. She hasn't been happy for years. I'm offering her a chance to start over, to build something better." "You're offering her a chance to be useful to you." David leaned forward, his voice dropping to a more intimate level. "Let me ask you something. When's the last time you made Arden feel special? When's the last time you surprised her, or took her somewhere exciting, or made her feel like she was the most important thing in your world?" The questions hit home because I couldn't answer them. Marriage isn't about constant romance and grand gestures. It's about partnership, commitment, building something together over time. "And how's that working out for you?" Before I could respond, David's phone buzzed with a text message. He glanced at it and smiled, the expression transforming his face into something warmer and more genuine than anything I'd seen from him all evening. "Speak of the devil," he said, typing a quick response. "Arden's confirming our plans for tomorrow night." "What plans?" "We're driving up to the city for dinner. There's a restaurant she's always wanted to try, and I thought it would be nice to show her some of the places we could go regularly if she decides to start fresh." I felt something twist in my chest that might have been jealousy or might have been grief. "You're taking her to the city." "Just for the evening. We'll be back late, but I want her to get a sense of what life could be like with broader horizons. More seduction. More honesty. I'm not hiding what I can offer her, Pierce. Can you say the same?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. What could I offer Arden that would compete with David Brennan's promises of travel and adventure and professional opportunities? What did I have that could match his house in the hills and his connections in major cities? "I can offer her a family that stays together," I said finally. I can offer her children who don't have to choose between their parents. I can offer her a marriage that's based on something more substantial than nostalgia and financial opportunity. And if that's not enough for her, then I guess I'll have to accept her decision and figure out how to move forward. David finished his drink and stood up, extending his hand for a final handshake. I hope you understand that I'm not trying to be your enemy, Pierce. I'm just a man who knows what he wants and isn't afraid to pursue it. Even if pursuing it destroys other people's lives, even then. After he left, I sat alone at the table for another hour, nursing my beer and trying to process everything I'd learned. David Brennan was exactly what I'd suspected, a calculating opportunist who saw Arden as a path to both personal and professional satisfaction. But he was also charming and confident and wealthy enough to offer her things I never could. The worst part was that he might genuinely care for her. His feelings didn't have to be pure to be real, and Arden's happiness didn't have to be his primary motivation for him to make her happier than I had been able to do. When I finally got home, the house was dark except for a light in the kitchen. I found Arden at the table with a cup of tea, still dressed in her work clothes. "How did it go?" she asked. "He's everything you said he was. Charming, successful, confident. But he's also been in contact with you for 6 weeks without telling me. This isn't a sudden romantic gesture, Arden. This is something you've been planning for over a month." Arden's cheeks flushed, but she didn't deny it. "I wanted to be sure about my feelings before I said anything to you. And now you're sure. I'm sure that I want to explore the possibility. David makes me feel alive again, Pierce. When I talk to him, I remember who I used to be before I got caught up in the routine of work and kids and paying bills. And who were you before all that? I was someone with dreams. Someone who believed she could do important work, make a difference in the world. Someone who thought life should be an adventure, not just a series of obligations." I sat down across from her, noting the way her eyes lit up when she talked about David and the future he was offering. "What about Sophie and Ben? What about the dreams we had together?" "Our dreams changed, Pierce. We both know that. We settled for a comfortable life instead of an exciting one. And somewhere along the way, we stopped being partners and became just roommates. Is that really how you see us?" Arden reached across the table and took my hand, her touch gentle but somehow final. "I see us as two people who tried to make something work and discovered we want different things. That's not anyone's fault, but it's not sustainable either. So you're going to leave." "I'm going to seriously consider it. Tomorrow night, when David takes me to the city, I'm going to try to imagine what life would be like with him. And then I'm going to make a decision. By Friday. By Friday." I squeezed her hand and then let it go, already feeling the distance growing between us. "What if I fought for you? What if I made grand gestures and promised to change and tried to convince you to stay? Would you mean it? I don't know. Maybe, if I thought it would work." Arden smiled sadly. "That's exactly the problem, Pierce. You'd be doing it because you thought you should, not because you couldn't bear to lose me. David would move mountains to keep me happy. You'd make a reasonable effort and hope it was enough." The accuracy of her assessment stung because it was probably true. I would try to save our marriage because it was the right thing to do, because breaking up our family would hurt the kids, because starting over at 45 seemed overwhelming and exhausting. But I wouldn't fight for her with the desperate passion that David Brennan was bringing to his pursuit. I wouldn't reorganize my entire life around making her happy, wouldn't sacrifice my own comfort and security for the chance to win her back. Maybe that made me a bad husband, or maybe it just made me honest about what I was willing to give and what I expected in return. "I hope he makes you happy," I said, and was surprised to discover that I meant it. "I hope so too." That night, I lay awake listening to Arden sleep beside me and tried to imagine what our life would look like after she was gone. The house would be quieter, the bills would be harder to manage, The kids would split their time between two homes. I would have to learn how to be a single father, how to explain to friends and neighbors why my wife had left, how to start dating again after 17 years of marriage. It should have been terrifying, but instead I felt something that might have been relief. For the first time in months, I knew exactly where I stood. Arden was leaving, David Brennan was using her, and I was going to have to figure out how to protect my children from the fallout. At least now I knew what I was dealing with. Friday morning arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that usually made me optimistic about the day ahead. But as I sat in my kitchen drinking coffee and watching Arden get ready for what might be our last day as a married couple, optimism felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. She moved through her morning routine with the focused energy of someone preparing for something important. Her outfit was carefully chosen, a burgundy dress that brought out the color of her eyes, jewelry that caught the light when she moved. She looked beautiful and excited, and I found myself memorizing the details in case this was the last time I saw her as my wife. "What time will you be home tonight?" I asked, as she gathered her purse and keys. "Late. David's made reservations at some restaurant in the city that's supposed to be amazing. We probably won't start driving back until 10 or 11. Drive carefully." "I will." She paused at the kitchen door, looking back at me with an expression that might have been regret or might have been pity. "Pierce, whatever happens, I want you to know that I don't regret our life together. We had some good years, raised two wonderful kids. That matters. But it's not enough. It's not enough for me. I'm sorry." After she left, I called in sick to work and drove to Gina's apartment. My sister was getting ready for her shift at the bakery, but she took one look at my face and called her manager to say she'd be late. "Today's the day?" she asked, pouring coffee into 2 travel mugs. "Tonight she goes to the city with him. Tomorrow she gives him her answer. And you're just going to let it happen? What choice do I have? I can't force her to stay married to me." Gina studied my face for a moment. "You could tell her what you found out about David, about his financial problems, his pattern of dating multiple women, his interest in her firm's municipal contracts. She wouldn't believe me, or she'd think I was just trying to sabotage her chance at happiness. So you're giving up?" "I'm accepting reality." Gina shook her head. "That's not the brother I know. The Pierce I grew up with would never walk away from a fight without throwing at least one punch." "This isn't a fight, Gina. This is my wife choosing someone else. This is your wife being manipulated by a man who's using her. There's a difference." I thought about David Brennan's confident smile, his expensive clothes, his easy promises of a better life. Maybe. But even if you're right, what am I supposed to do about it? You're supposed to protect your family, even if that means protecting Arden from her own bad judgment. Before I could respond, Gina's phone rang. She glanced at the caller ID and frowned. "It's my friend Janet. She works at the bank downtown." Gina answered the call, and I watched her expression change as she listened to whatever Janet was telling her. After a few minutes of mostly one-sided conversation punctuated by Gina's increasingly excited responses, she hung up and turned to me with a grin. "We need to take a drive," she said. "Where?" "To the bank. Janet has some information about David Brennan that I think you'll find very interesting." 20 minutes later, we were sitting in Janet's office at First National Bank, a small room decorated with family photos and motivational posters about achieving financial goals. Janet was a woman in her 50s who'd worked at the bank for 20 years and knew more about the financial lives of local residents than anyone had a right to know. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she said, glancing nervously at her closed office door. "But Gina said it was important, and I've known your family for years." "What did you find?" I asked. "David Brennan applied for a business loan 6 weeks ago, a big one, $2 million to expand his law firm and cover some existing debts. We turned him down because his debt-to-income ratio was too high and his collateral was insufficient." 6 weeks ago, Gina repeated, looking at me meaningfully. right around the time he first contacted Arden. That's not the interesting part, Janet continued. The interesting part is what he listed as his expected income for the next fiscal year. He projected a 40% increase in revenue based on what he called anticipated municipal contracts and development projects. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. He was counting on getting city contracts before he'd even applied for them. It gets better. When we asked him to provide more details about these anticipated contracts, he mentioned the downtown redevelopment project specifically, said he had inside information that suggested his firm would be handling the legal work. Inside information, Gina said, 6 weeks ago, before he'd supposedly reconnected with Arden. Janet nodded. I pulled the application this morning after Gina called. He also listed Arden's firm as a potential business partner, said they were discussing collaboration opportunities that would benefit both companies. I stared at the loan application documents Janet had spread across her desk, seeing David Brennan's careful handwriting outlining a business plan that depended on access to information and opportunities that only Arden could provide. He was planning this from the beginning, I said. The romantic reunion, the proposal, all of it. He needed a way to get close to Arden so he could access information about the municipal contracts. But why go to such elaborate lengths? Gina asked. Why not just approach her professionally? Because a professional approach wouldn't give him the kind of access he needs, I said, the pieces finally falling into place. As her business partner, he'd get some information. As her husband, he'd get everything. Access to her files, her computer, her conversations with city officials. He'd be able to influence her decisions, maybe even get her to steer contracts toward his firm. Janet looked uncomfortable with the direction of our conversation. I really shouldn't have shared this information with you. If anyone finds out, no one will find out, I assured her. But Janet, you may have just saved my family. After we left the bank, Gina and I drove to a coffee shop across town where we could talk without being overheard. I spread copies of the loan application documents across our table and tried to figure out how to use what we'd learned. You have to tell Arden, Gina said. Show her these documents, explain what David's really after. She's a smart woman. Once she sees the evidence, she'll understand that she's being used. Will she? Or will she think I'm so desperate to keep her that I'd forge documents and make up stories about David's motivations? These aren't forged documents, Pierce. This is real evidence from a bank loan application. Evidence that David applied for a loan and mentioned Arden's firm as a potential partner. That's not proof of some elaborate con game. It could be interpreted as a legitimate business opportunity that developed alongside their personal relationship. Gina frowned. You're overthinking this. I'm thinking like Arden will think. She's already convinced that David loves her and wants to build a life with her. She's not going to abandon that belief based on a loan application that could have multiple explanations. So what do you want to do? I studied the documents for a long moment, thinking about David Brennan's confident smile and Arden's excited expression when she talked about their future together. An idea began to form, risky and probably stupid, but potentially effective. I want to give David exactly what he's been asking for, I said. What do you mean? He wants inside information about municipal contracts. I'm going to make sure he gets it. Pierce, not real information, false information, information that will expose him for what he really is. I explained my plan to Gina, watching her expression change from confusion to concern to reluctant admiration. It was a long shot, and it required perfect timing, but if it worked, it would prove David's true motivations in a way that even Arden couldn't ignore. This is crazy, Gina said when I finished. Probably. It could backfire completely. Arden could end up even more convinced that you're just trying to sabotage her relationship. That's a risk I'm willing to take. And if it works? If you expose David as a fraud? What makes you think Arden will come back to you just because her other option turns out to be a mistake? The question stopped me cold because I didn't have a good answer. Even if I proved that David Brennan was using her, that didn't address the fundamental issues in our marriage that had made her vulnerable to his manipulation in the first place. Maybe she won't come back, I said finally. Maybe this is just about making sure she doesn't make a decision based on false information. You're willing to blow up your marriage to protect her from a man who's lying to her? I'm willing to blow up my marriage to protect my kids from watching their mother get used by a man who doesn't really love her. Gina was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. You really love her, don't you? Even after everything that's happened. I love the woman I married. I'm not sure that woman exists anymore, but I love the memory of her. And I love my kids enough to try to save them from the fallout of their mother's bad judgment. Okay, Gina said finally. What do you need me to do? I spent the rest of the day putting my plan into motion, making phone calls and setting up the pieces that would either expose David Brennan's true motivations or destroy what was left of my marriage. By the time evening arrived, everything was in place. Arden came home at 6 to change clothes for her dinner in the city. She looked nervous and excited, like a teenager getting ready for prom. I watched her apply makeup with extra care, choosing jewelry that complemented her dress, checking her reflection from multiple angles. You look beautiful, I said from the bedroom doorway. Thank you. She turned to face me, and for a moment I saw a flash of the woman I'd fallen in love with 20 years ago. Pierce, I want you to know that whatever I decide tomorrow, it's not because you're not a good man. You are. You're a wonderful father and a decent husband, and you deserve to be happy. But not with you. I don't think I can make you happy anymore. And I don't think you can make me happy either. That's not anyone's fault, but it's the truth. A car horn honked outside, David arriving to pick her up for their evening in the city. That's him, Arden said, gathering her purse and jacket. I'll be home late, but I'll try not to wake you. Arden, wait. She paused at the bedroom door. What? Be careful tonight. Make sure you're making this decision for the right reasons. What do you mean? I mean, make sure David wants you for who you are, not for what you can do for him. Arden's expression hardened slightly. I know you don't like him, Pierce, but David's not using me. He loves me. I hope you're right. After she left, I sat in my home office and activated the final piece of my plan. If everything went according to schedule, David Brennan would reveal his true motivations before the evening was over. All I had to do was wait for my phone to ring. It rang at 11:47 p.m. Pierce, it's me. Arden's voice was tight with anger and hurt. We need to talk. Where are you? At home. David just dropped me off. Can you come downstairs? I found her in the kitchen, still wearing her dress from dinner, but with her makeup smeared and her hair disheveled. She looked like someone who'd been crying, and when she looked up at me, her eyes were red with tears and fury. You were right, she said. About David. About everything. I sat down across from her at the kitchen table. What happened? He got a phone call during dinner from someone at the city planning office congratulating him on securing the legal work for the downtown redevelopment project. Except the person said they were looking forward to working with his inside source at Kavanaugh and Associates. I kept my expression neutral, even though my heart was racing. The phone call had been from Gina, using a burner phone and claiming to be from the planning office. It was a risky gambit, but it had apparently worked. What did David say? He tried to play it off, said it must be a misunderstanding. But when I pressed him about it, he finally admitted that he'd been cultivating our relationship partly because of my access to information about city contracts. Partly? He said he did have feelings for me, but that he also saw an opportunity to benefit both of us professionally. He made it sound like a partnership, like he was doing me a favor by offering to help advance my career. And you believed him? Arden's laugh was bitter. I wanted to believe him. Even after that phone call, even after he basically admitted to using me, I wanted to believe that his feelings were real. But then I remembered something you said about being careful, about making sure he wanted me for the right reasons. So I tested him. How? I told him I'd been thinking about his proposal and that I was ready to say yes, but that I wanted to make one condition. I wanted to keep my job at Kavanaugh and Associates instead of moving to a new firm in the city. I waited for her to continue, sensing that this was the crucial moment in her story. He couldn't hide his disappointment, Pierce. For just a second, his mask slipped, and I saw exactly what you'd been trying to tell me. He doesn't want a wife who works for a different firm. He wants access to my current job, my current projects, my current connections. What did you tell him? I told him I needed time to think about it, and asked him to drive me home. The whole trip back was awkward and tense. He kept trying to convince me that moving to a new firm would be better for my career, that staying at Kavanaugh would be limiting myself. And now? Arden wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, smearing her mascara further. Now I feel like an idiot. Like a middle-aged woman who got swept off her feet by a smooth-talking man who saw her as a business opportunity. I reached across the table and took her hand. You're not an idiot. You're a woman who was unhappy in her marriage and got seduced by someone who promised her a different kind of life. A life that was never real. Maybe not. But your unhappiness was real, Arden. The problems in our marriage are real. David Brennan being a fraud doesn't fix what's broken between us. She looked at me with surprise, as if she'd expected me to use David's deception as a way to win her back. What are you saying? I'm saying that you were right about us growing apart. You were right that we stopped making each other happy. David exploited those problems, but he didn't create them. So what happens now? I squeezed her hand and then let it go. Now we figure out how to move forward. Maybe that means working on our marriage. Maybe it means ending it amicably. But whatever we decide, it should be based on what we really want, not on false promises from someone who was using both of us. Arden was quiet for a long moment, staring out the kitchen window at the dark street where David had dropped her off after their disastrous evening. I don't know if I can trust my own judgment anymore, she said finally. If I could be so wrong about David, how do I know what I really want? You take time to figure it out, without pressure from him or from me. You think about what would actually make you happy, not what someone else is telling you would make you happy. And what about you? What do you want? I thought about the question seriously. I want my kids to be okay. I want them to have parents who respect each other, even if we can't be married anymore. And I want you to be happy, Arden. Really happy, not just temporarily distracted by someone else's promises. Even if that happiness doesn't include you. Even then. We sat in silence for a while, both of us processing the end of a crisis that had threatened to destroy our family and the beginning of a conversation about what we actually wanted from our lives. Finally, Arden stood up and headed toward the stairs. I'm going to take a shower and go to bed. Tomorrow I'll call David and tell him I'm not interested in his proposal. And then we figure out what comes next. Together. As I listened to her footsteps on the stairs and the sound of water running in the bathroom above, I realized that my marriage might be over, but my family was going to survive. David Brennan had been exposed as a fraud. Arden had learned something important about herself and her judgment. And I had discovered that I was willing to fight for what mattered most to me. It wasn't the ending I'd hoped for, but it was honest. And after everything we'd been through, honesty felt like a good place to start. The next morning, I woke up to find Arden already gone, and a note on the kitchen counter explaining that she'd driven to David's office to return the jewelry he'd given her, and to make it clear that she wasn't interested in any kind of relationship with him. The note was signed Love Arden, the first time she'd used that word in a week. It wasn't much, but it was something.